What if the thing everyone told you would never happen just quietly happened, and almost nobody noticed? What if the U.S. military has been waiting months for exactly this moment, and Iran just handed it to them without a single dramatic headline? Before we go any further, do 3 quick things for me right now. Hit that like button like you're closing a door on a bad habit you're finally done with. Subscribe if you actually want to understand this war instead of just reacting to whatever headline shows up in your feed. And send this video to one person who keeps asking you what's really happening in the Gulf, because this is the one that finally explains it properly. For months, this war has followed a painfully familiar pattern. A strike here, a threat there, a ceasefire announced with total confidence that quietly falls apart a week later. You've probably felt that fatigue yourself, scrolling past headline after headline that all sound urgent but never actually move the story forward an inch. That pattern just broke. And it broke in a way that matters far more than most people realize, even though it didn't come with explosions or dramatic footage. On August 5th, Iran's foreign ministry confirmed something concrete for the first time in this entire conflict. Not a promise, not a warning, not another vague statement meant to buy a few days of calm. An actual agreement with Oman on the exact coordinates of a new shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz, real numbers, real lines on a real map, the kind of specific technical detail that naval planners, oil traders, insurance companies, and shipping operators around the world have been desperate for since this crisis first began. Let's be completely clear about what this is not, because Iran itself has been almost aggressive about drawing this line. Iran did not reopen the strait. Iran was careful, deliberate, almost repetitive about making sure nobody confused this agreement with a return to normal shipping. But for the first time since this war started, Iran put something specific and technical on the table instead of another round of angry statements, another threat, or another ceasefire that collapses before the ink even dries. That difference sounds small. It is not small. And understanding exactly why takes us back to how this entire crisis began in the first place. Rewind to late February. Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz after a wave of American and Israeli strikes hit targets deep inside its territory. This single stretch of water, just 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries close to 1/5 of the entire world's oil trade and nearly 1/5 of the planet's liquefied natural gas. When Iran closed it, the shockwaves hit gas prices, shipping insurance, and energy markets across the globe almost overnight. Governments that had nothing to do with this war suddenly found themselves watching fuel prices climb because of a standoff happening thousands of miles away. What followed was months of genuine chaos. Tankers were attacked in open water. Ships were boarded and seized. A tugboat went down beneath the waves. Seafarers were killed, some of them simply doing their jobs on vessels that had nothing to do with the politics driving this war. The United States responded with a full naval blockade and a sustained campaign of strikes against Iranian infrastructure near the coastline. Iran, in turn, kept insisting on something specific. Any ship using the older route through Omani waters, a route that had quietly become the default way for global shipping to avoid Iranian territory altogether, was committing what Iranian officials openly called an illegal act. That single grievance sits at the emotional core of this entire crisis, and I don't think enough coverage has actually explained why it matters so much to Tehran. This was never purely about oil or tolls or economics. It was about a country that felt like the rest of the world had quietly rerouted around it, pretending its coastline and its sovereignty simply didn't exist. Iran wanted to be seen. Iran wanted ships to have no choice but to acknowledge its waters. And for months, that demand looked like nothing more than wishful thinking backed up by threats and mines. So when word came out that Iran and Oman had actually agreed on new coordinates, agreed on exactly where ships should enter and exit the strait, and agreed to shut down the temporary routes that had been running near Iran's Larak Island and through Omani waters, that was not a minor technical update buried in a press release. That was Iran achieving something remarkably close to its original demand from the very start of this war. Ships would now have to route through waters that genuinely acknowledge Iranian sovereignty, instead of quietly slipping past it the way they had for years before this crisis even began. It's worth remembering that this isn't even the first time the world was told this strait was about to reopen. Back in early April, there was a moment where officials in Washington openly declared that the strait was set to reopen under a ceasefire framework with promises that commerce would flow freely again within days. That moment came and went. The ceasefire didn't hold the way anyone hoped, and the strait stayed effectively paralyzed for months afterward. I bring that up because it matters enormously for how you should judge this new agreement. This isn't the first optimistic announcement of this war. It's simply the first one built on actual coordinates, instead of a hopeful promise. That distinction is exactly why this one deserves to be taken more seriously than the one that came before it and quietly fell apart. And here's the part that almost nobody actually walked you through. This agreement did not appear out of nowhere. This is the piece of the story that most coverage skipped. Entirely because it doesn't make for a dramatic headline. Back in early April, while the strikes were still happening, while the news cycle was still dominated entirely by explosions and blockade enforcement, Iranian and Omani officials were already meeting quietly behind closed doors, deputy foreign ministers, technical specialists, people carefully working through legal jurisdiction questions and environmental protocols, far away from any camera or press conference. That diplomatic channel never actually stopped, not even during the worst weeks of open conflict. It kept moving patiently in the background while the entire world's attention was locked onto the noise happening above the surface. By late July, that quiet channel finally picked up real speed. A series of high-level meetings in Tehran pushed the technical details into their final stages. 3 intense weeks of focused negotiation followed, building directly on everything both sides had already worked out since the original memorandum signed back in June. And that patience is exactly why the final agreement carries genuine weight instead of feeling like empty theater. This wasn't a rushed framework thrown together under pressure just to generate a headline. It was the product of months of grinding, unglamorous, detail-obsessed diplomatic work that finally produced something specific enough to actually matter on the water. Here's a detail that deserves your full attention because it tells you exactly how carefully engineered this entire arrangement really is. The agreement includes a proposed joint coordination center, a shared operational system where Iran and Oman would actually manage maritime traffic together and collect real-time information from vessels passing through the strait. Think about that for a second. 2 countries that have spent this entire war standing on opposite sides of a genuine security nightmare are now being asked to sit down and run a shared operations desk together, coordinating the exact waterway that nearly triggered a much wider regional war. And Iran's own deputy foreign minister was completely blunt about the timeline attached to all of this. This arrangement is not being framed as permanent. It is a trial run, somewhere between 2 and 4 months, extendable further only if it actually performs the way both sides hope it will. Think about what that really tells you. Iran is not standing up and claiming total victory here. Iran is proposing a controlled experiment, a test both sides can quietly evaluate before committing to anything larger or more permanent. That is not the language of a government desperate to end this war on any available terms. That is the language of a government trying to buy stability for itself without giving up a single piece of long-term leverage. Because here's the tension sitting right at the exact center of this entire story, and it's the part I think matters most. In the very same breath that Iran announced this agreement to the world, its foreign ministry spokesman said something you genuinely cannot ignore if you want to understand where this war is actually heading. An understanding with Oman, he said, plainly, does not mean the strait has suddenly become safe. The factors creating real insecurity, and he pointed directly and specifically at the United States, have not been resolved in any way. Iranian officials went even further than that, stating flatly and repeatedly that a genuine reopening of the strait depends entirely on Washington lifting its naval blockade and ending all strikes on Iranian infrastructure across the region. So picture the full scene here for a moment. Iran hands the entire world genuine, verifiable, checkable progress, actual coordinates on a real map, an actual restructured shipping route, an actual joint operations plan with a neighboring government. And in that exact same statement, Iran draws a hard, unmistakable line. It says, none of this changes anything about the deeper standoff until Washington moves first. That combination is the real story hiding underneath this headline. It is not a contradiction, even though it might sound like one at first. It is a strategy, carefully built and carefully worded. Iran found a way to relieve the one part of this crisis that is quietly bleeding its own economy dry, the near-total paralysis of its main export corridor, without giving up a single meaningful inch on the larger political fight still raging with Washington. Now, let's talk about why the American military has genuinely, actively been waiting for something like this to happen, because the real value here goes far beyond simple symbolism or diplomatic optics. Every single day this blockade continues, the United States has to maintain an absolutely enormous, expensive, and exhausting military operation just to keep it functioning. Constant naval presence around the clock, continuous aerial surveillance, sweeping the same stretch of water day after day, repeated boarding and interception missions against vessels attempting to slip past the blockade under cover of darkness or bad weather. That kind of sustained enforcement effort pulls ships, aircraft, and personnel away from every other mission the American military is already juggling across an increasingly stretched global footprint. A real working agreement, even a fragile 2 to 4 month trial run, offers something a purely one-sided American blockade could never provide on its own, an actual off-ramp. A realistic way to gradually wind enforcement down that doesn't require Washington to simply declare victory and walk away unilaterally, risking the appearance of weakness or premature retreat. Instead, It allows the entire posture to ease off gradually, running alongside a jointly managed framework that two separate regional players have actually signed their names onto together. That is a meaningfully more stable, more durable outcome than either side simply blinking first under pressure. And it is exactly the kind of negotiated, verifiable framework that military planners generally prefer over an indefinite standoff with no clear resolution mechanism attached to it whatsoever. Before we go any further, let's pause here for a second, because I genuinely want you thinking along with me instead of just passively watching. If you're finding this useful so far, drop a single word in the comments right now. Type coordinates if you believe this agreement is the real turning point in this entire war. Type pressure valve if you think Iran is simply buying itself time. I'm going to read through every single comment later, and I honestly want to see which side ends up winning this argument. There's a timing detail buried in all of this that I genuinely don't think is a coincidence, and it deserves real attention. This agreement landed right around the exact same window as the 60-day deadline set by the original Memorandum of Understanding, signed back in June between Iran and the United States. That specific deadline was supposed to produce a much broader final deal, one that would cover the hardest and most explosive questions of all: Iran's nuclear program and the massive pile of frozen Iranian assets sitting untouched in foreign banks around the world. That deadline expired without any real resolution whatsoever. Both sides quietly acknowledged, in their own separate ways, that the bigger comprehensive deal had effectively stalled out completely. So think carefully about what Iran actually chose to do here. With the giant comprehensive deal frozen solid and going nowhere, Iran deliberately turned its attention toward the one piece of this entire crisis where real, tangible progress was still genuinely achievable: the technical mechanics of maritime shipping. Iran banked a real, concrete, verifiable win on the easier problem, while the much harder political fight remained completely and stubbornly stuck. This is actually a fairly familiar pattern in complicated multi-issue standoffs like this one. When the giant deal simply cannot move forward, both sides often go hunting for smaller wins they can still realistically deliver, partly to keep some diplomatic momentum alive for their own domestic audiences, and partly to avoid sliding back into open, unrestrained hostility, while the truly impossible questions keep grinding along completely untouched in the background. There's also a domestic political wrinkle here that deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. Iran's own negotiators openly admitted that even after finalizing these coordinates on paper down to the last technical detail, the actual real-world implementation still needs formal sign-off from Iran's senior leadership before anything can actually go into effect. That might sound like a simple bureaucratic formality. It genuinely is not. Iran has been dealing with a deeply fractured leadership structure ever since losing its supreme leader earlier this year. Multiple competing power centers, conflicting statements coming from different officials on the same day, an unclear, unsettled chain of who actually holds final authority over major decisions on the same day. An unclear, unsettled chain of who actually holds final authority over major decisions. That single requirement, waiting patiently for a full leadership consensus, has quietly been the bottleneck behind nearly every major decision this war has forced Iran to make so far. A technically flawless agreement on paper means remarkably little if it simply sits there waiting for a green light that never fully arrives. Now let's zoom. Decision this war has forced Iran to make so far. A technically flawless agreement on paper means remarkably little if it simply sits there waiting for a green light that never fully arrives. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this strait is genuinely not some obscure regional footnote you can casually dismiss. Roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil shipments, and close to 1/5 of all global liquefied natural gas, pass through this one narrow 34-kilometer-wide channel every single day. That single fact alone is why governments, energy markets, and shipping insurers all over the world have been tracking every tiny development here with genuinely intense focus for months. A closed strait doesn't just hurt Iran or the Gulf states sitting closest to it. It reaches into gas stations in countries that have never had a single ship pass through these waters, into the cost of heating a home in the middle of winter thousands of miles away, into airline ticket prices and shipping fees for goods that have nothing to do with oil at all. That's the strange, quiet way a conflict over a 34-kilometer channel ends up touching almost everyone on the planet, whether they've ever heard of the Strait of Hormuz or not. And even while this specific piece of diplomacy was quietly moving forward behind the scenes, the broader region has remained genuinely unstable in other ways. Yemen's Houthi movement, widely understood as an Iranian-aligned force, has continued claiming fresh attacks on tankers in the Red Sea during this exact same period. Progress at one narrow choke point clearly does not automatically mean calm across the entire wider map of this conflict. And it's worth remembering the human cost sitting quietly underneath all these numbers and coordinates. because it's easy to talk about shipping lanes and forget that real people have been paying for this crisis every single day it drags on. Seafarers killed on tankers that had nothing to do with the politics driving this war. Port workers hurt in Bahrain. Crews stuck for weeks on ships anchored outside a strait they couldn't safely cross. Families of ordinary sailors who had no say in any of this, waiting for news, hoping the next attack claimed by the Houthis or reported near the coast wasn't the one involving someone they loved. Every delay in resolving this crisis isn't just an abstract line on an economic chart. It's real risk sitting on real people, which is exactly why a genuine working framework, even an imperfect one running on a trial basis, actually matters far beyond the world of diplomats and naval planners. What's genuinely striking, and worth sitting with for a moment, is that Iran hasn't allowed this specific agreement to quietly fade into the background, the way so many wartime announcements typically do within days. 10 days after the initial confirmation, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman came back out publicly and reaffirmed the whole thing again, stating that despite what he called deliberate American obstruction, the talks kept producing genuinely positive progress, and that the shipping route map had truly, verifiably been agreed upon by both sides. That kind of repeated, deliberate public reaffirmation tells you something quietly important about Iran's own thinking. Iran clearly wants this specific win to stay visible in the public conversation. It wants the wider world, and very likely its own domestic population, to keep seeing this as concrete proof that something real is actually moving forward, even while the much larger standoff with Washington remains completely frozen in place around it. Let's actually try to make sense of everything we've just walked through together, because I genuinely think the honest reading here is far more interesting than any single simple headline could ever capture on its own. Iran has found a genuinely clever way to demonstrate visible, checkable progress on the exact part of this crisis that's hurting its own economy the most while giving away almost nothing meaningful on the much bigger political fight still separating it from Washington. This is not the war quietly ending. Iran has gone out of its way again and again to make absolutely sure nobody mistakes this agreement for peace. But it is a real, checkable, genuinely specific step forward after months where nearly every single headline coming out of this conflict was either another explosion, another empty threat, or another broken deadline nobody actually expected to hold. And that raises the real question, hanging quietly over everything we just covered. Together, does small, careful, incremental progress like this eventually build up enough trust between both sides to unlock the truly impossible questions, the nuclear program, the frozen assets, the full and final removal of the blockade itself? Or does it simply become a permanent halfway state, a war that never technically ends because both sides have quietly found a way to make the ongoing pain just barely bearable enough to keep avoiding what actually started all of this in the first place? Here's my third ask before we get closer to the ending, and I genuinely want this one to actually mean something rather than just sit there as an empty formality. If this video helped you understand something you were genuinely confused about before you clicked on it, do one simple thing for me right now. Share it with someone who's been asking you what's actually happening in the Gulf, because one private message from a friend cuts through more noise than any algorithm ever could. That kind of quiet support is exactly what keeps independent channels like this one alive and honest, able to keep digging through raw statements and technical details instead of just repeating whatever headline happens to be trending that day. Think for a moment about the sheer technical difficulty of what Iran and Oman actually managed to pull off here, completely separate from all the political theater surrounding it. Redrawing entire shipping corridors through one of the most congested and genuinely dangerous waterways on the planet, in the middle of an active military blockade, with warships from multiple different nations still actively patrolling those exact same waters day and night, is an extraordinarily difficult technical and legal puzzle to solve. Jurisdiction questions that touch on sovereignty itself, environmental protocols that have to satisfy both governments simultaneously, security coordination between two militaries that don't fully trust each other, all of it somehow worked out in roughly 3 intense weeks of negotiation, sitting on top of months of quiet, patient groundwork stretching all the way back to June. That is a genuinely impressive piece of diplomacy, no matter which side of this conflict you personally find yourself rooting for, and completely regardless of how the larger political war eventually resolves itself down the road. There's one more layer worth adding here, because it changes how you should read Iran's public messaging going forward. Iran claims Washington wasn't directly involved in shaping these specific coordinates, framing this as something Tehran and Muscat worked out largely on their own. At the very same time, American officials have publicly described the broader Hormuz negotiations as moving along nicely, which suggests Washington is watching this bilateral peace very closely, even while staying formally on the outside of it. That's not unusual in diplomacy like this. Sometimes, the fastest way to make progress on a politically sensitive issue is to let two smaller players work out the details first, while the bigger power quietly signals approval from a safe distance without attaching its name to every decision. If that's what's actually happening here, it tells you Washington may be more comfortable with this arrangement than its public silence on the details might suggest. So where does all of this actually leave us right now? Iran gave the world its first real, physical, genuinely checkable piece of progress in this entire war. Not another empty promise. Not another ceasefire that quietly dissolves the moment the cameras stop looking. Actual coordinates on an actual map. An actual restructured shipping route. An actual joint system for managing maritime traffic, together with a former rival turned reluctant partner. And in that exact same breath, Iran made absolutely sure everyone understood that none of this changes anything about the deeper underlying standoff until the United States is willing to move first. That is, the tightrope Iran is walking right now, in real time, with the entire world watching. Enough genuine progress to ease the economic bleeding happening back home, not nearly enough concession to lose its long-term leverage abroad. Whether that tightrope eventually leads somewhere real and lasting, or whether it simply becomes the permanent shape of this entire conflict. Repeated 2 to 4 month extensions, stretching on indefinitely without ever actually resolving the deeper questions underneath, is genuinely the single biggest question that's going to define how the rest of this year plays out across the entire Gulf region. And it's worth asking yourself honestly what the alternative to this trial period even looks like. If this framework quietly fails, if trust between Iran and Oman breaks down, or if Washington decides the pace of progress isn't fast enough, the region doesn't just freeze in place. It risks sliding backward into exactly the kind of open confrontation that killed sailors, sank a tugboat, and sent energy prices spiking earlier this year. That's the quiet weight sitting behind every one of these technical negotiations. This isn't just diplomats trading paperwork over coordinates on a map. It's an attempt to prevent a return to the worst months this conflict has already produced. And that's precisely why even a fragile, temporary framework like this one deserves to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as empty theater. One last thing before I let you go today, and this one is my final way of saying thank you for sticking with me through the whole story. If you want to actually see this map for yourself, the proposed route, the coordinates, the way Iranian and Omani waters now connect, I'll be breaking that down visually in the very next video, piece by piece, so make sure notifications are actually turned on if you don't want to miss it the moment it goes up. I want to know exactly where you personally land on all of this. Do you think Iran just handed Washington a genuine workable off-ramp, a real template both sides can quietly build the rest of a lasting settlement around? Or do you think Iran simply found the exact amount of pressure release it needed to keep negotiating forever without ever actually finishing anything at all? Write your answer down in the comments in one full sentence this time, not just a single word, because I genuinely want to read the actual reasoning behind wherever you personally land on this. Before I give you my final take, one more small ask, and I promise this is the last one. If you've made it this far into the video, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly rather than skimming a headline and moving on. That kind of attention is rare, and it deserves something back. So do this for me. Tap that subscribe button if you haven't already, but this time, turn on the little bell next to it. Breakdowns like this one only work if you actually see them the moment they go up, not 3 days later, after the story has already moved on without you. Whatever side you land on, here's what I think is genuinely undeniable after everything we just walked through together. For the first time in months, this war produced something you can actually point to on a real map. Instead of just another forgettable headline you'll have moved past entirely by tomorrow morning. That alone tells you the ground underneath this entire conflict is quietly shifting, even if nobody directly involved is fully ready to admit yet just how far it's already moved. Keep this space close, keep watching carefully, because when the next real piece of this puzzle finally falls into place, you're going to want to already understand everything that led up to it. And when that moment comes, I'll be right here, breaking it down for you the second it happens, the same way I have with every twist this war has thrown at us so far.